Ever since the Las Vegas shooting back in October, in which Stephen Paddock used rifles equipped with bump stocks to spray bullets from a Mandalay Bay hotel room down to attendees at a country music concert below, the banning of the device has been a common rallying point for gun control advocates. You'll recall the device is a sliding stock that allows the shooter to harness the weapon's recoil energy. By maintaining forward pressure on the weapon, the bump stock bounces the trigger off the shooter's finger to produce simulated automatic fire. It produces an effect of firing multiple rounds rapidly. We heard speakers at the March for Our Lives event this weekend calling for the ban.
When they give us that inch, that bump stock ban, we will take a mile.
We've heard Democratic politicians making the same call.
Ban the bump stocks, has a bill that bans something that enables a shooter to spray murderous automatic fire on innocent people.
Even the NRA called for executive review of the device's compliance with federal law, and the president himself recently pledged to ban bump stocks through executive action.
And I'm going to write that out, because we can do that with an executive order. I'm going to write the bump stock, essentially write it out. So you won't have to worry about bump stock. Shortly, that'll be gone.
Now, the context for that quote is Senator John Cornyn of Texas proposing a legislative solution to this issue, and the president replying that's not needed because he's going to solve it through executive action. And that approach is where this issue gets interesting, and in my opinion, highly controversial and worthy of some criticism. On Friday, Attorney General Jeff Sessions released a regulation proposal to make bump stocks illegal, not Congress proposing a law, not a court of law finding that bump stocks actually fall within the legal definition of existing regulation of automatic weapons and machine guns, but just the executive branch writing new policy. Or at least that's how I characterize this move, though Jeff Sessions himself and his boss, the president, would disagree. But it's that process here I think we should all be concerned about. Whether you're a Second Amendment absolutist or someone who wants to repeal it and confiscate all the firearms, the important question in this story is not whether bump stocks should be legal or illegal. The important question here is what process we should use to decide. Unless you're a fan of gigantic executive power, the process in play here should concern you. So let's refresh our memories with some background information first, and then take a look at what the Trump administration is actually doing. First, recall that automatic firearms, or machine guns as we often call them, guns that shoot multiple rounds or a stream of rounds per trigger squeeze, these are already regulated strictly by the National Firearms Act of 1934. That law defines a machine gun as any weapon that shoots more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. On technical terms, that is not what a bump stock does. A bump stock still requires one trigger function to fire one round. It just achieves that function through different means, which is why on at least 2 occasions the Obama administration confirmed their legality. In June 2010, the ATF sent a letter to Slide Fire, a bump stock manufacturer, in which ATF technology chief John Spencer wrote, quote, "The stock has no automatically functioning mechanical parts or springs and performs no automatic mechanical function when installed. Accordingly, we find that the bump stock is a firearm part and is not regulated as a firearm under the Gun Control Act or the National Firearms Act." And at least one similar letter was also sent to another manufacturer in 2012. Now, have the facts around bump stocks magically changed in the time since then? They have not. Only the political pressure surrounding them has, in the aftermath of a mass shooter using them in a high-profile attack. And that political pressure went straight from the President of the United States to Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who is now tasked with explaining why these bump stocks are suddenly now illegal under existing law, and therefore no additional law from Congress is necessary to ban them. To make this case, Sessions reframes the statutory term trigger function as trigger pull, writing, quote, "Ordinarily, to operate a semi-automatic firearm, the shooter must repeatedly pull and release the trigger to allow it to reset, so that only one shot is fired with each pull of the trigger. When a bump stock type device is affixed to a semi-automatic firearm, however, the device harnesses the recoil energy to slide the firearm back and forth, so the trigger automatically re-engages by bumping to the shooter's stationary finger without additional physical manipulation of the trigger by the shooter. He continues, the bump stock type device functions as a self-acting and self-regulating force that channels the firearm's recoil energy into a continuous back and forth cycle that allows the shooter to attain continuous firing after a single pull of the trigger, so long as the trigger finger remains stationary on the device's extension ledge as designed. No further physical manipulation of the trigger by the shooter is required. You got some problems here, Jeff. First, to say a bump stock operates automatically, independent of the shooter, ignores the need for the shooter to maintain forward pressure on the weapon to get the desired effect, a necessity you acknowledge in your own writing. Simply holding down the trigger does not produce the same effect. It requires shooter manipulation. Second, reframing the statutory language of trigger function as trigger pull is simply an interpretation of the law that's convenient to your purposes, not faithful to the law as written. The law says function of the trigger. Now, whether that trigger function is achieved by a finger pulling the trigger or by another force pushing the trigger into a stationary finger is irrelevant because the law says function, not pull. What Sessions is doing here is at best a radical new interpretation of existing law, and at worst, and what I would argue, is he's actually creating new law. And the big problem is neither of these things are the function of the executive branch. Creating new law is the domain of Congress. The interpretation of law is the domain of the courts. Sessions' job is to enforce existing law as written. And as I understand this scenario, that is not what he's doing, though it sounds like he's just doing his job at the direction of his boss. In practical terms, if this regulation becomes finalized, reportedly it will, pending legal challenge, require all bump stock owners to surrender or destroy them, otherwise be charged with illegally possessing machine guns, a felony punishable by up to 10 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. A punishment that harsh simply for having something that's supposedly been illegal this whole time. We're just now finding out about it because of political pressure and the whims of this president and reasons. And that is why I don't think anybody should be happy with this move. Even if you hate guns, even if you want bump stocks banned or even all guns banned, are you really comfortable with this much power in Trump's hands? The power essentially to create new law unilaterally. You shouldn't be. If you're a gun rights person, obviously you don't want your rights diminished at all, but certainly not through executive action. Whatever your opinion on bump stocks or on guns in general, I hope we can all agree that if you want to ban something new, Congress needs to write new law, and the courts need to interpret it. If we allow the executive to assume these roles, our separation of powers gets eroded, and power gets centralized. And even if you're forever Team Trump and you like him having this power during his term, I suspect you won't once someone else assumes his office. Don't let it slide just because you like the president. Don't let it slide just because you like the outcome. The process by which we make these decisions is far more important than both of those things. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at ML Christensen. You're always welcome to come hang out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it.